Okay, good morning everyone. Hope you can hear us okay. There's a few people putting their headphones on. Can I check everyone can hear on the panel? Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much for joining the session today, folks. So I'm Doug Wilson. I'm Science Director from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. In a moment, I'll ask the rest of the panel to introduce themselves as we go through the first question. But I mean, just to say, I think the topic of biodiversity and the role it plays is incredibly important, as you may expect from the panel we've got gathered here today. This is part of London Climate Week, and I think one of the things we're really keen to explore is that relationship between nature and climate. We have described those as two separate crises, but actually they are intrinsically linked. What we want to explore today through the panel is partly that link, how they fit together, but also, I think through the expertise we've got gathered, actually look at some of the practical solutions. There's a lot of talk about the problems of climate change, the problems around biodiversity, but actually talk around how we actually address some of these in really practical terms as well. So what I'll do first of all, just in the first question, we'll just go along in order. So if the panelists are able to introduce themselves as we go through, but really to understand, what do you see as the biggest threats to biodiversity, and what role does your organisation play within that? And I'm going to come to Nicola first.
Thank you. I would say that the greatest threat to biodiversity is if we don't think about nature in the solutions that we are developing and delivering. So I work for Plant Life International, and we're an organisation based in the UK, and we're looking at the natural world through the lens of wild plants and fungi. So we're literally looking at it from the soil and the vegetation upwards. And we're looking for how we can integrate plants and wild fungi into solutions. You all walked in this morning past a living wall. Plants are a nature-based solution. And so I think the actual biggest threat is when we don't consider how to integrate nature into our land management systems and our environmental solutions, and including the community need alongside the nature need.
Great, thank you, Nicola. And some themes I'm sure we'll come back to the course of the discussion. Cleo? We can't.
I'll try this one. So it's great to be here. Thanks for coming to this session. For those of you that don't know, BirdLife International is a conservation network made up of 123 national conservation organisations around the world. And the membership of BirdLife, the BirdLife partners, are doing lots of work on the ground with communities, delivering nature conservation, nature-based solutions. In terms of threats, another part of BirdLife's role is as the global science hub for bird data. So we're responsible for the red list data on birds globally. We also host the key biodiversity areas databases. So we have lots of detailed data on threats to birds, habitat degradation, climate change. But I think if you think about it at the large scale in terms of threats, obviously this is largely that our economic systems are not set up to value natural capital. And I think in terms of BirdLife's role, a big part of that has been these are complex problems, and a role for BirdLife is to be part of those democratic voices in these countries around the world. You know, these are complex problems that need very diverse actors in the solution. So the BirdLife Partnership is part of that national voice that rolls up to regional and global voices.
Great, thank you, Cleo. And I think very much that point, which I'm sure we'll come back to, is organisations such as yourselves acting that voice for nature as really representing that within this wider system as well. Brilliant, thank you. Catherine, let me come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So I'm Director of Climate Change and Evidence at the Wildlife Trusts, another environmental NGO. We're one of the largest UK landholding NGOs, so we have about 100,000 hectares of nature reserves across the UK. We're one of the top 10 largest landholders in the UK. But we're federated, so we're actually 47 independent charities, so we don't often make the list, but we are pretty big when you put us together. We get very involved in climate action through nature-based solutions in nature markets and helping communities. We're very locally based but with a national focus, so helping communities to engage with nature and to get the benefits from nature as well. From my perspective, interesting already listening to some of the discussions this morning, is the biggest threat would be our continued inability to understand that nature is absolutely fundamental to society, to the economy, and to human survival. And actually, it's been interesting. I haven't heard nature come up quite so much in the talk so far this morning, but when people are prompted, they do start to talk about nature. It tends to be at the moment carbon, bit of nature at the bottom, but actually I think that is starting to change. We're really delighted that that's starting to change, and obviously that's what we're here to talk about today.
Thanks, Catherine. I think, again, that will come through as well. Just the fact this is part of a system, you can't deal with one part of it in isolation. It's going to be absolutely critical as well, so thank you. Okay, Ashley, let me come to you next.
Sure. My name is Ashley Kamhai. I'm the Director of Innovative Finance at the Wildlife Conservation Society. It's a large global conservation nonprofit, very bottom-up. We work on a lot of excellent science, a lot of different types of conservation globally. My work is focused on scaling finance for tropical forest conservation. I spend a lot of time talking with people in the private sector, talking with financial institutions, and talking with corporates. And I think that, your question was about what's the biggest threat to biodiversity, and everyone answered not using the word biodiversity. And I think that is actually one of the biggest challenges, is that when you're talking with people outside of our field, they don't know what biodiversity means. It doesn't mean anything to them. And so it's really hard for them to say, okay, how do I incorporate that into the work that I do, into the business? How do I have a conversation with a colleague about biodiversity, because it just doesn't have that sort of tangible meaning to them. And so when I talk about biodiversity, I really just talk about nature finance, right? That resonates, this idea of nature. People have sort of a visual, whether that's thinking about things related to specific plants or specific animals, and they can think about how that impacts their cities or their work, whether it's in agriculture. But I think just like really being able to think about how we talk about these things and how it really integrates into not just like people's day-to-day life, but these larger systems that we exist within is really important if we think about all the really good work that we know that needs to be done, and how we think about bringing the different types of financing into that.
Great, thank you, Ashley, and really making that part of the lexicon as well, rather than just a bit of an add-on, and maybe something we'll touch on as well around how this actually put it across to people as well. Okay, and then finally, Gareth, let me come to you.
Hello, very nice to see a packed audience. So Gareth Thomas with the Natural History Museum over in London. I think the biggest threat isn't necessarily just biodiversity loss, but it's actually thinking it's someone else's problem. And I think everyone here would agree that we're facing a planetary emergency, not because we lack the data, but I think because we're failing to act upon it. And at the Natural History Museum, we've got 80 million specimens across 4.5 billion years of history, the largest collection in the world. And yes, we are the Dinosaur Museum in South Kensington, and tonight we're going to be unveiling our new Nanosaur, which is very exciting. I'm quite looking forward to seeing that. But we've also got 400 scientists who work behind the scenes, and people don't often know that. Last year we welcomed 6.3 million guests through our door. So that gives us this wonderful opportunity to bring together the public with scientists, with policymakers, with businesses, all into one conversation. And it's why our mission is to create advocates for the planet, and even more importantly, to create solutions for nature, from nature. And that can be driven through technology, and that can be driven through data. And I think what we're turning abstract biodiversity loss into essentially decision-ready insights for people who are acting on the ground, whether that's through initiatives understanding biodiversity change or biodiversity and health, or whether that's through programs such as the National Education Nature Park, which I'll talk a little bit later on. But
Great, thank you. A great example of outreach as well, just to be able to really connect with people around that. Okay, so thank you. So hopefully that gives you an introduction as to who we've got on the panel today. So we've got a discussion lined up. We've got various questions that I'll go through. And then at the end of the session, what I'm hoping for is any questions from you, from the audience as well. So we'll have a roving mic for that part. Okay, so this has come up a little bit already, but one of the first areas I want to look at is around scale. There's some huge challenges here. So I guess the first question is really this balance between local action and global. Is there an order in which change should happen? Should it be global to local or vice versa as well? So Catherine, let me come to you first for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the obvious answer is, you need all of those happening at the same time. So I'll start with the obvious answer because everyone's probably thinking it. But I might try and just give a few examples of how that looks in real life, if you like. I mentioned that we're very a locally based set of charities, but we have a national and increasingly a global focus. And I would say that really, really works well when you're trying to actually act and do this stuff on the ground. It's really, really important to be community-led in what we do and to try and start from where people are. Yesterday, I attended a meeting about DESNZ's new public engagement strategy on net zero as an example, where they've started very, very top-down. And my previous background as a civil servant, again, very, very top-down. That works when you're thinking about a national problem in a high-level kind of broad set of measures that you might want to take, but it does not work when you're trying to engage people to take action and when you're trying to increase the importance of something in everyday life. So we do see local action, community action is really, really important. It's most of what we do at the Wildlife Trusts is engaging local communities, particularly more marginalised communities in particular with nature. But we have a national focus as well, so stuff we do on nature markets, stuff that my team does on our net zero targets and government advocacy, that's obviously all national level. But increasingly we're global as well, and part of what we really want to do more of is talking about how the relevance of global agreements and global negotiations through the UN or the COPs we were hearing about earlier, you can agree or disagree on how effective they've been, but what happens at those meetings has ramifications at the local level. And part of, I think, the role of us as NGOs and other organisations should be communicating the importance of that down to the local level. So yes, obviously it's everything, but in the context it's good to think about where are you sitting in your roles and how are you connecting between the national, the local and the global and making sure that those things work together.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And the interplay between those, as you say. Okay, Gareth, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so as you say, it's both, isn't it? Top down, bottom up, synchronised at the same time, because we need everything. And I briefly mentioned the National Education Nature Park, and you can use that as a really nice example. So, for example, a school in East London mapped their concrete playground, identified habitat gaps, secured funding, planted new trees, and worked with scientists from the Natural History Museum, the Royal Horticultural Society, and used tools from trusts such as the National Biodiversity Network, so their NBN Atlas or the iNaturalist app, and they use these at a very local scale. However, when you zoom out, that programme now has over 6,000 schools mapped across England, and I think it counts for nearly 8 million square metres of mapping. Now, that's nearly 3 times the size of the City of London, and that all contributes to national biodiversity data sets, and that contributes to global data sets. So you go from very, very local to very, very global quite quickly. And crucially, that data doesn't then just sit in a drawer, but it informs policy, it informs business decision makers, and it's used by planners. Another example comes from the Biodiversity Intactness Index, so the BII, which is developed by the Biodiversity Futures Lab at the museum. Now, the data for that comes from very, very local people out in a field with a quadrat, with a transect, with a butterfly net, capturing on-the-ground data. But its application is absolutely global. It's a component indicator for the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's used by businesses, it's used by financial institutions. So all of a sudden, what is very local becomes very global. And to give you an idea, the BII is a way of measuring ecosystem health, essentially. And to put it into context, a score above 90% would represent a functioning, healthy, resilient ecosystem. Now, the world at the moment we believe to be about 60%, and the UK about 31%. So, of the developed nations, very much, unfortunately, in the bottom ranking. Now, that's because of land conversion over time and intensive agriculture. But what that figure reflects, essentially, is real-world degradation, which has direct impacts for food security, for water, filtration, and all the other ecosystem services that we as humans rely on. So I think change happens when local ambition meets global application, and I think that's driven by agency through youth engagement.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. And also, as you say, that real signal as well around that from kind of government policy, etc. as well, but how that really feeds and informs action. Okay, Ashley, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I think I take a little bit of a different perspective on it, just because most of my work is thinking about how do you scale finance for large intact tropical forests. If you look at where these forests are, you're talking about the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, and a little bit of Southeast Asia. And there are people living in these areas. There are people on a local level that have been conserving large intact tropical forests for decades. And we're all free riders off of that work, right? We all benefit from those. We're all receiving ecosystem services, whether it's regulation of the climate, regulation of water, different pollination services for agriculture. So we're all benefiting, and we're not paying, right? That's sort of the tragedy of the commons that we all know exists and have never really been able to figure out how to solve. And so when I think about local, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about communities on the ground, indigenous communities, local communities, government, local nonprofit who are on the ground doing the work. And really, I think just in really the last 5 or 10 years, the research community has started, and the more international policy community start to recognize the importance of these different actors on the ground and the work that they're doing. And so in my work, I really spent a lot of time talking with different corporations and financial institutions to understand better how do they think about these areas. Are they thinking about these areas in terms of the benefits they receive on a regional level? They have a farm or they have a timber company in an area where they're benefiting from the rainfall from these areas. Are they thinking about these areas at all? Or are they just saying, listen, this isn't within our supply chain, it's not our problem? And really trying to bring together and match the different levels, because we know that intact tropical forests globally are providing different services on a global level, on a regional level, on a local level. And so it's really about bringing in, like Gareth was saying, what are the tools, whether it's the BII or whether it's a different metric, what are the tools we can use to really have conversations with these companies to be able to say, listen, this is what's happening on the ground. You're benefiting from these areas. There are tools, there is data that exists that you can then integrate into thinking about your company's dependencies and how you're benefiting from these areas. And then once you have that, you can actually do something about it. Instead of saying, listen, sure, maybe we're benefiting from these areas, not my problem. What about this company? What about this company? It's you really need tools like the BII to be able to have that sort of larger scale conversation with the private sector and be able to think about, okay, you have the tools, you have the data, then what does that look like? How do you really think about getting finance to these areas? And what does that look like? And really sort of being the person in the middle that's making the connection between what's happening on the global and the regional and the local as well.
Thanks, Ashley. And as you say, some people really very much on the front line of this, and others maybe a step removed. But that's going to shift over time as well, isn't it? And how you really make sure that that's real and make those links through is going to be really important. Okay, thank you. Just going to explore a different area if we can. So the panel have already talked quite a lot around that link between local, national and international action as well. A lot of that can only be done by really working in partnerships, and we've got some good examples of that already. But I suppose in doing that, I suppose one of the challenges is the more people you work with, the more complex it gets, the more bureaucracy potentially as well. So just interested in understanding the balance and how you might achieve that as well. So I guess, Cleo, for you first of all, what makes a really good international collaboration, and how do you really get benefit from that?
Yeah, great question, Doug. I'm just going to build from Ashley and give you another really big world example of why these international partnerships are important. So from a bird perspective, I think you'll all be familiar with migration of birds, annual migration in the UK. Obviously, swallows, swifts, cuckoos, very familiar species for us. 20% of the world's species actually migrate. So this is billions of birds migrating backwards and forwards over the course of the year. All of these dependent on hundreds or thousands of sites across their migratory pathways to stop off and rest and feed. For example, in the Africa-Eurasia, there are 4 main flyways in the world. In the Africa-Eurasia flyway, which is involving more than 600 species, this relates to 100 countries across that flyway and obviously thousands of sites. So if you're going to try and, I think the other point is that these sites, these thousands of sites, are critical for biodiversity, for nature, but also, as we've been talking about, for climate in terms of the carbon storage that they represent and the carbon sequestration that the potential they have, and vitally important for the communities that they support. So it's in all our interest to be working together collectively to protect these flyways, these sites across the flyways, and that involves hundreds of countries. It involves very diverse actors. As you say, it involves all the way down from the ground up to governments. I think some of the factors in sort of ensuring the success of such a big partnership like this is making sure that all voices are heard, finding sort of structures that can channel those voices right from the ground up to the top. It needs sound science, both in terms of the global data sets that some of the panellists here, we have hold of some of the global data sets and can provide good indicators, but it's also around sort of harnessing that knowledge from the ground. We need policy frameworks. So we've got global biodiversity framework for the flyways. We have the Convention on Migratory Species, which then sets up flyway strategies. But in a sense, those are sort of the easy parts. I mean, they are complex, but they're almost the easy parts that we've got quite some good track records in sort of establishing those sort of science and policy frameworks. And to make the partnerships work, you need to have. It is about having those sort of flyways of itself in terms of the knowledge from the ground, and it's that consistency of funding because change takes time. So that's why a lot of us are sort of thinking about sustainable financing, innovative financing, trying to get beyond the sort of project-based financing, which is so stop-start.
Great, thank you, Claire, and really powerful example there. As so many environmental challenges simply don't respect international borders as well, so working collectively is important and complicated, as you say. Nicola, let me come to you for your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Doug. I think the answer to a good global partnership is, as you say, the same answer to how we work locally and globally. So, for instance, Plant Life, we coordinate the Global Important Plant Area programme, so that's looking to identify and conserve places in nations around the world which are the most important for plant diversity. And in order to undertake an important plant area assessment and partnership, we need to really understand the needs of the in-country partners, essentially. So it may be a global construct where we start, but actually the solution ends up being locally driven. One of the examples I might draw on would be looking to identify important plant areas in Bolivia. And it was really important to understand how the national and regional government structures were going to take forward any conservation action. What would really work for them? Is it a park basis? Is it some other kind of investment or infrastructure? But fundamentally what was important was to understand the needs of the local communities. How was it going to make a difference from their perspective? Because if it doesn't work for the local communities who are understanding how those forest systems work that they're working with and their livelihoods are dependent, you're not going to get the buy-in. So you need a partnership that understands who is actually the land steward, which is back to my point at the beginning around the fact that you integrate nature into your land management actions, and that's how you get your results. So we work with local communities who are forest custodians, and they're making a living out of the products that they're getting out of the forest. And once they can make livelihoods, they can start to be part of the voice, which means that they don't want those forests to be destroyed for other land uses. And then the regional governments can take that and they can use that as part of their protection. So for me, a good global partnership is taking account of all the mechanisms you need for success and bringing them all together.
Thanks. And of course, all that takes time, and really listening to people is key, isn't it, as well, rather than just some superficial engagement exercise.
Absolutely, yes. You can't parachute into a particular space, whether it's a local space or a country, and come with your ideas. You have to have flexibility and understanding as to how it's going to really work for the people who are going to be the ones making it happen in the long term.
Great, thank you. Okay, so just to keep moving and just tie in, as you may expect, so the next area I want to look at is around funding, that horrible topic of money. So I guess just a question for Gareth in the first place, what funding models work from your experience or not, and any lessons that have learned around them?
Yeah, I think it's not that we just need more money, which we do, but actually we need smarter systems and more public trust, because it's not that there's necessarily a shortage of finance available, but actually there's a shortage of investable confidence. Now, some stats I've got here, so private finance for nature over the last 4 years has increased from about $9 billion to over $100 billion. So money is going into the restoration. It's still just a long way behind where climate obviously is. And actually there was a report released yesterday by Bloomberg and the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. And as we're in London, I thought I'd talk about the UK. But in 2024, nature-related jobs accounted for about £2.2 billion in revenue and created about 21,000 jobs. And there's just under £3 billion worth of assets under management in different funds. So the money is going in, but ecosystem restoration requires a diversification of funding, whether that's philanthropic, whether that's public, whether that's private. Now, in the UK, we have Biodiversity Net Gain, where developers are required to provide a 10% uplift in biodiversity as an offset for the land conversion in their development. Now, that's getting a lot of international attraction, though it's small scale at the moment. But projects like Castle Howard, where they're re-wetting wetlands and habitat restoration, they're backed by local trusts, and actually it's predicted that projects like that are one of the creating these biodiversity net gain credits, and two, that particular project is expected to increase biodiversity by about 200% in that area. So funding's going into nature restoration, and then the outputs are being monitored and modelled to understand what's the end result. And I think that's really important. I also work with the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, the IAPB. Last year at COP16 in Cali, we launched the high-level framework. But actually what we need is more practical case studies. Because when you look at the markets, there are about 30 or so nascent biodiversity credit markets, accounting for something like $6 billion this year, so way behind where the voluntary carbon markets are, and it's predicted to increase to about 38 billion over the next 7 years or so. And as with the others on the panel here, I would say that we work in sustainable finance and investment, and you may wonder why I was talking about the National Education Nature Park, partly because it's the cities obviously, but actually I think sometimes the best return on investment is education. So schools creating green corridors and habitats, well, for me that's actually intergenerational return on an investment. If we can inspire our children and our futures who are going to be hit long after we've passed, then there's no better investment.
Great, thanks, Gareth. And again, but a real strong point there around just the need for this to be long term as well, and the really strong signals around it. Thank you. Some really good examples. Catherine, let me come to you.
Yeah, I'll give an example as well for this one on funding, and also want to wrap it back to why we're talking about nature in a climate conference. So a couple of years ago, we signed a nearly £40 million deal with Aviva, the insurance company, to restore temperate rainforest across the west of the UK. So this is deciduous woodlands, predominantly oak woodlands, but they have a really, really special microclimate. They're covered in lichens and mosses. It's a very damp environment, fantastic at storing carbon, and really, really high biodiversity value. There's quite a lot of interest growing in temperate rainforests because the UK should be one of the global strongholds because we have most of the climate space for them, but we only have about 1% of what we should have for temperate rainforests in the UK. So for us as the Wildlife Trust, we're really interested in it as a habitat and for its climate benefits. Aviva are very interested in it because they have a net zero 2040 target, so they are interested in the carbon. But actually what we loved about this partnership, and going back to what Cleo and Nicola were saying about partnerships, it took us a year to arrange this partnership of discussions and contract negotiations to make sure that we were both on the same page and both companies, both organisations were getting what they wanted. But they're very interested for the carbon. But what we really love about the deal and the way Aviva have looked at it is they realise that these assets that they're investing in are going to be more resilient, more beneficial, and more economically viable if they think about the wider issues, if they think about the nature value of the woodlands, the community value, and the resilience value. Just as an example, so obviously everyone here knows woodlands soak up carbon. We have to have more woodland planting in the UK to meet our net zero target. But those woodlands are at risk themselves from wildfire, from drought, from disease. If we're not creating resilient habitats, if we're not thinking about the nature component of how you create a resilient habitat, we're building solutions that may not last. So when you're looking at these things in the wider context, they are bound to be better for carbon in the long run. And just to add to that, on the global scale, obviously, to date, nature is the only thing that has been absorbing pretty much the only thing that's been absorbing all the emissions we've been putting into the atmosphere. So the land and the ocean sink has absorbed something like half of the carbon that we've emitted into the atmosphere so far. And our degradation of the natural environment is probably causing that carbon sink to weaken. And that's a really dangerous game to be playing. So yes, the Aviva deal is something about funding. We think it's the biggest corporate donation for nature-based solutions in the country to date, one of the biggest certainly. But on a global scale, the more we get those sorts of partnerships working, the more we can start to turn around this big risk we're playing with nature, that it's not going to keep fulfilling that service it's been giving us in mopping up all of our carbon emissions.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And that, certainly for our own work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, one of the things we come across all the time is people saying, we'd like to invest in this, but we need confidence in what that means. You know, how long is, for example, carbon going to stay locked up for? What's that mean in terms of those wider benefits as well? And there's a lot of work to do to really understand that and give people that confidence. Great, thank you. Okay, so the next area I want to look at is going to be linked to the previous point. But so that was really around nature restoration. The other aspect is conservation, protecting what's there already. So Nicola, let me come to you first. Just in terms of any differences in the approach you need to take there, and how do we make sure that the funding is there to actually keep the habitats intact rather than degrade?
I think it's really important that we remember that it does take time for nature to recover. And actually the results are very often in that maintenance or management period. So of course we need to have finance to enable us to create or restore habitats. But it's that longer term management where we're really going to get the successes. And you need assurance still, and in order for assurance, and that's assurance for both investors but insurance for the landowners who are going to undertake this action, then you need some stability and you need some commitment. So Gareth mentioned biodiversity net gain, and that's been really good in terms of a statutory driver for nature markets. It doesn't have stability at the moment because the government is consulting on its future. That has a direct impact on whether landowners today, and we've seen it recently in the past month or so, who are not sure about going into that scheme at the moment. So you need the stability. But when it is stable, and also you can use voluntary measures instead of statutory measures, you need the commitment, and I think that's where it comes in. So an example I would use would be work that Plant Life's doing with national highways, and this is where they've taken a voluntary approach to using the biodiversity net gain approach, so they can quantify the biodiversity enhancement, and we have a meadow makers programme. So yes, there's an element of restoration there, but at the moment we're working on a 10 million phase with national highways. The vast majority of that funding is going directly into the pockets of the landowners. Plant Life provides them with the expertise and the steer on how to either make the meadows or then manage the meadows into that longer term. And it enables those landowners to make a choice to do this over a 15-year period. They have confidence that they are going to be supported both financially but also with the expertise that they need to make a difference. So it's more models like that where we have got investors who are saying this is something that we want to see, nature recovery, and we know it's going to happen somewhere else, and we need channels to allow the finance to flow into the pockets of those who make the difference.
Yeah, thank you. So again, that theme around that continuity, that confidence that comes from that as well. Cleo?
Yeah, I think I maybe just want to dig in further around why is it important to conserve nature as well as restore nature? And obviously it's vital for both. And why is it relevant to London Climate Week? I mean, I think if we think about the global emissions, global emissions rates that we're currently at, which is around 40 to 42 gigatons of carbon equivalent per year, if you compare that to the carbon that's actually stored in our intact habitats worldwide, that's 2,000 gigatons, that's 50 times more. So fossil fuel emission reductions is obviously a critical part of our pathway to a livable planet. So is restoration. But I think the nature conservation angle, the sort of the vital part of conserving what we have, often gets forgotten. And Maggie Charnley from DEFRA sort of kicked off London Climate Week on Monday, sort of making the case that this is a finance problem that we really just have not cracked. And there are some innovative solutions. Ashley might tell us about those. There's the one that Brazil is really pioneering at the moment, the Tropical Forest Forever facility. But Maggie Charnley's point is that there's a real need for more and more innovation around financing conservation. And if I may, I just wanted to bring that sort of to life with one example that I'm working closely on at the moment, which is to work with BirdLife partners in the Pampas grasslands in Latin America. So we have got a carbon project there. We're really excited about the carbon project. This is around sort of incentivizing ranchers to implement restorative grazing techniques on their grasslands. So that's a restoration activity. The thing is that the ranches where this will have most impact, you can imagine around Buenos Aires, for example. These are large, fairly affluent farmers. They can afford to invest in the fencing infrastructure and other infrastructure that you need for a carbon project. They will get quite a big delta on their carbon sequestration. This is where a sort of carbon project model works, because you're fostering change, which is what we want to see. But if you're thinking about the grasslands that are the most important for biodiversity, they have the largest sequestered carbon inside their soils. That's up in the north, say, for example, in Argentina. It's up in the northern, more marginal grasslands, where the ranchers are more marginal themselves. They don't have the finance to invest in a carbon project, and they also wouldn't get that real change in carbon. So there needs to be something that really incentivizes those ranchers, or is a benefit for those ranchers, to keep doing what they've been doing for years, which is sort of managing these grasslands in a really effective way for people, biodiversity and climate.
Thanks, Leo. And that, as you say, just learning from what works internationally as well, maybe transfers to other parts of the world as well. Yeah, key. Thank you. Ashley, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that everyone has said on the panel. I've always thought that it wasn't about there wasn't enough money. It's really about incentives, right? So we exist in a market structure where unless something is cut down or about to be cut down, it doesn't have a value. We all know it has a value, right? We spend our careers because of recognizing that and working on that, but our current system doesn't value that. So we don't put a value on climate regulation. For example, like if it is a tropical forest and it's absorbing carbon, right? We can show that, we know that, but it doesn't have a value within the voluntary carbon market the way it exists today. So we're very focused on this idea of improvement. So additionality, right? It's like, are you doing something that wouldn't have otherwise happened? So that is important, and we know, for example, you look at the Brazilian Amazon, half of it has already been cut down. There is a huge need, and there's a lot of finance through carbon going into restoration, and there's an existing market. But when you look at these areas that are about really maintenance and protecting those, I don't think any of us want to see those go. Even if you don't believe they have high biodiversity or absorbing carbon, I don't think anyone wants to say, okay, yes, we want to see these areas cut down. We know they're important, we care about them, and yet there's no financial structure. And Maggie was very right when she said that. We really haven't, in our field, figured out how to solve for this financial issue. So you do have Brazil, which has come together with this idea of a tropical forest forever facility to really price intact tropical forests. It's incredibly interesting and innovative. We'll see how that works out. That's a big global political initiative, and that has its pros and cons. And so I think for us at the Wildlife Conservation Society, we're very focused on creating a new financial mechanism to really put a value on these areas. And we are seeing a burgeoning biodiversity credit market. Whether this goes into that, I think, is to be determined. I think there's exciting prospects. There's part of this biodiversity credit market that looks at uplift. Great, that's important, similar to the voluntary carbon market, but that sort of nature stewardship, maintenance piece of it, equally as important. And up until now, and again, it's very new, a lot of conversations, a lot of panels on this topic. It's been mostly philanthropic funds. And so how do you get from that to a real demand for the maintenance of these areas? I think for us, there's different ways to look at it. And one of them is really thinking about how you connect the ecosystem services in these areas to the private sector, which is really hard to do because most of these areas that are intact are really far away from a lot of infrastructure. They're far away from timber, they're far away from agriculture, they're far away from roads. That's why they're still intact and big, right? So if you're looking at a 3 million hectare national park in the northern part of Amazonas where we work, the reason it's still intact is because it is very far from other things. And that's a good thing. We look at it as sort of as a negative, but it's actually a good thing. And so we've been working with a lot of hydrologists in Brazil to looking at the flow of rainfall and actually being able to show and work with companies that they are benefiting from the rainfall that's being provided out of these intact tropical forests to beverage companies, to hydroelectric, to agriculture, to timber. And I think that that's starting to shift the conversation, but we're still in sort of an interesting space where unless you can really show rigorous science like this intact tropical forest to this farm, people don't really want to take responsibility or accountability for conserving that. And that is a really hard space to be, where everyone's saying like, not my problem, where we really need sort of a collective response and a collective recognition of that. And so that's a lot of the work that we're doing, is really trying to galvanize the private sector, whether that's corporations sort of internalizing that this actually is part of their value chain, especially on a regional level in the Amazon. Also just taking a step back and saying, okay, we know there's a lot of money out there. How do we get that money where it needs to go? So I spend a lot of my time working with financial institutions, looking at different blended finance mechanisms, different bond instruments, saying, can we use what already exists in the finance space instead of creating something new and sexy? Like, what is already there that institutions are very comfortable with? They do every day, right? This is just their normal work. So how do you take that's normal to them and link it to the work that we're all doing and bring that together? And they're very different conversations and very different languages, and you need someone in the middle to start to bring that together. And I think we're seeing that a lot, this idea of just bringing together sort of business as usual in the finance space with the work that we're doing in conservation and restoration to do and utilize some of these really interesting bond mechanisms that companies do all the time. Sovereign governments issue bonds all the time. It's just normal business. And so how do you start to link that to restoration, to conservation? And we've seen in the last 3 to 5 years some really interesting bonds that the World Bank has done and other institutions that have done to really start to funnel large-scale finance into some of these areas.
And you say the role of the intermediary in there, someone who will actually translate between scientific language around nature, biodiversity, and how that works in financial terms as well. It seems to be kind of key. Great. Okay. I'm just conscious of time, so we've got a number of other topics to cover, and I would like to get some questions from the audience if we can. So I'll probably ask the panel to be a bit more quick fire as well. So the first area that really comes up very strongly throughout all the discussion is just the role and the importance of data and knowledge to really inform these decisions. So Gareth, I'll come to you first. What would you see as the most exciting technology development in terms of data gathering and analysis as well?
Let's keep it concise because we do want to get some questions in. I would just say that technology isn't the answer, it's an amplifier, and we can, as a society, become over-reliant on technology. We think that us scientists or technologists or futurists are going to save the world and shoot us all off to Mars and we'll live there happily ever after. But that's just not the case. Technology is great, and we are doing amazing things, whether it's bioacoustics, whether it's AI, whether it's data gathering. And I'm a trustee at the Chester Zoo, which is one of the world's largest conservation zoological societies. They're working with University of Liverpool to build out AI camera technology, which can then track in situ conservation. So that's really cool for species preservation and enforcing legislation, but we can't become over-reliant on it. We need to address the underlying issues and resolve those first, because ultimately there's no technology that can photosynthesize, sequester carbon, act as a storm barrier, surge barrier, etc., all at once. The best technology is nature.
Very powerful. So why try to replace that? As someone said the other day, new batteries will not replace bees. Yeah. Okay, Nicola, your thoughts on that?
I think when we think about carbon and nature, we're probably very comfortable with solutions such as forests, and we reach to plant a tree. But one of the other habitats that I believe Cleo mentioned earlier is grasslands. Grasslands are also a carbon and nature solution. And in terms of how plant life operates, we advocate for grasslands to be considered a nature-based solution. And that can happen at a really local level. So Plant Life leads the No Mow May movement, which many of you here may know about, and that's about how you can take action in your very local space. And in order for us to understand how increasing species richness in local grasslands such as your lawns or your parks is really going to make a big difference and it's quantified, we are using a combination of citizen science and AI to help us to gather that data. So we have a trial underway at the moment with Lincoln University and Northumberland University, and essentially we are teaching AI with citizen science volunteers how to identify the plant species in photography. Because if you use imagery, you can then take photographs of the vegetation, but we need the AI to understand what species it can see there. You're probably quite used to using your phone to snap a picture of a species and for it to tell you what it is. And this is about understanding how we can do that with a wider range of species, essentially. So I think it's an option for us to gather the information in on a large scale that then proves the point that the actions that we're undertaking are really making a difference. So it's quite exciting to explore these areas.
Great, thank you. It's amazing, actually. We got through nearly that whole conversation, and AI only mentioned twice at the very end as well, which is quite incredible. So I've just been given the sign to wrap up. So I apologize, I won't get through all the other points, but I'd just like to thank all the people on the panel for all their contributions. Hopefully that's giving you some food for thought. And I'm sure anybody will be really happy to follow up on that afterwards as well with any points. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for your time, everyone.